Malcolm X was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. Malcolm and his family moved to Michigan early on in his childhood, where his family struggled after his father was killed by a streetcar. And it was believed to be a murder, not just a random accident. After the death of his father, Malcolm eventually moved to Boston, where he became involved in criminal activity. As he was serving a sentence from 1946 to 1952, Malcolm underwent the conversion to Islam in prison. The Nation of Islam upheld elements of Islam combined with elements of Black nationalism. Many African Americans joined the nation in an attempt to climb the social and economic ladder or to have a sense of community. Malcolm helped grow the nation tremendously as he shifted from a minister position to being more of a civil rights activist. Combining elements of the civil rights movement with elements of Islam is what made him so popular. This got the attention of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, as well as the United States FBI. Elijah Muhammad wanted to stay away from the sort of mainstream political discourse at the time, and the FBI saw Malcolm as a threat. Malcolm X was frustrated by other civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. during this time. He criticized mainstream activists for their catering towards white people. Malcolm believed in Black liberation and no compromises. This is where his catchphrase, "by any means necessary," comes into play. He said the MLK style of activism was, quote, "wishy-washy, love the enemy approach." In 1965, Malcolm was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom, and there's actually still a huge amount of controversy around who killed him and why. Malcolm X isn't simply misrepresented, he's underrepresented or not represented at all. I'm going to directly quote from Nazeb Rahim's article, Malcolm X Before the Symbol is Whitewashed from History, because I think she explains this perfectly and I don't really want to undermine her message by paraphrasing. More than ever today, he stands for the truth that we are uncomfortable to face up to and the ongoing struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed. This perhaps is why the current mainstream and elite narrative is hesitant to give him the status his impact necessitates. Malcolm's fundamental assertion was to challenge discourse in existing political frameworks, not settling simply to operate within them. It is time we pick up what El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, or Malcolm X, left for us to finish. The whitewashed version of Malcolm X is just one example of the white power structure focusing on civil rights figures that are much more palatable to the white masses and therefore much easier to teach in schools, both then and now. In schools, Malcolm X really isn't taught that much. When students are asked about civil rights leaders, I bet the vast majority of students would mention Martin Luther King Jr. before Malcolm X. And I think this is on purpose. Malcolm X had minimal formal education. He was a drug dealer, a pimp, and a hustler as a teenager. He went directly against the white power structure created by the West by tapping into his African roots, while Martin Luther King Jr. was much less intimidating towards the white power structure with his formal education and constant advocacy for peaceful protests and demonstrations. While Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideas were progressive, had a positive impact, and advanced the civil rights movement, it's important to also recognize the more radical, less mainstream figures like Malcolm X. The current approach to teaching about the civil rights movement, specifically Malcolm X, is harmful because it teaches students that social progress was achieved solely because of nonviolent, peaceful protests and ideas, like those of Martin Luther King. We're taught that the white power structure will produce change if confronted peacefully. In reality, it did not produce change because of solely peaceful protesting. Like previously stated, the current education system makes the civil rights movement very palatable to the white power structure. In not recognizing the violence and sacrifice it took for social progress, we teach students to not question the classist and racist white power structure that still oppresses so many Black and brown bodies today. We are creating the next generation of obedient capitalist workers to fuel the hierarchy when we should be teaching students about the hardships, violence, and sacrifice it took for change, not only in the civil rights movement, but also the push for women's rights, workers' rights, unions, etc.